This week on Dialogue, historian Timothy Snyder and his new book, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guests this week are Timothy Snyder and Blair Ruble. Timothy Snyder is a professor of history at Yale University. He's the author of several award-winning books and joins us today to talk about his latest work, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. Blair Ruble is director of the Wilson Center's oldest program, the Kennan Institute, and also directs the Center's Comparative Urban Studies Program. Gentlemen, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
Blair, let's begin with tell our viewers about the Kennan Institute. We know it well here, obviously, but tell MHZ viewers about it.
Well, the Kennan Institute was established in 1974, and it has supported academic research and public and academic dialogue on then the Soviet Union and now Russia, Ukraine, and the surrounding region ever since.
And tell us also about Comparative Urban Studies.
And Comparative Urban Studies supports public dialogue about urban policies and conditions around the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Now, if you recall, I don't know if you do, the way this program came about, Blair walked into my office with an advanced reading copy of your book and said, I think this is one to take a look at. I think this is going to be an important book. Why did you think it was going to be important when you first heard about it?
Well, I think this is a very important region, and Tim will explain why perhaps better than I can. But this is the European heart of darkness of the 20th century, and for understanding the century and where we go from here, you really have to understand what happened in the region he's writing about. It's a really fundamental piece of history for understanding the current human condition.
Tim, what is different about your book? You're covering some well-covered territory. What makes this particular approach different?
Well, what the book does is bring together a number of events that we're used to thinking of as separate, distinct, and unrelated. Soviet terror, the Holocaust, all of Stalin's killing policies, and all of Hitler's. The premise of the book, which allows me to bring these events together and narrate them as one story, is very simple. It's that almost all of the German killing and a disproportionate amount of the Soviet killing took place in one relatively compact territory, which I call the Bloodlands, over a relatively short period of time, from about 1933 to 1945. So the book begins from the observation that a total of about 14 million non-combatants, mostly women and children, were killed in that time and place. And then it proceeds to discuss events, some of them familiar, as you say, some of them less familiar, which brought about all of this loss of life.
The 12-year period, that's significant because that is the overlap between Hitler and Stalin?
The 12-year period is the period when both Hitler and Stalin were in power, yeah.
And tell us more about the geography. What is the area that you're defining as the Bloodlands?
Mm-hmm. That's an important question because this area is not a country, it's not an empire, it's lands between. It's precisely the lands between Berlin and Moscow. It's the lands that are contested between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. It's lands that were once regarded as important because of agriculture, and it's also the lands which were once the great homeland of the Jews of the world. These are the lands also between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. So they're between great powers. They contain a history which is receding from us, and they contain a mixture of peoples, a mixture of religions, which is now lost. So one of the jobs of the book is not only to explain the killing, but to recall a bit of this world.
You write about the geographic significance of Poland. Could you explain that?
Stalin and Hitler were different, and the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were different kinds of states, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit more. But there were certain overlaps of interest. There were certain parts of the geopolitical world that they saw the same way, and Poland is the chief example. Both the Nazis and Stalin agreed that the existence of Poland was a kind of accident, and they agreed that for different reasons, from different ideologies, and obviously having different distinct interests, that it would be to their mutual advantage if the state of Poland didn't exist. And this is crucial because Poland is in the middle of where all the killing takes place. It's in the middle of the Holocaust, among other things. And the Second World War begins with a Soviet-German alliance which destroys Poland.
Now, when you read the book, it makes perfect sense to talk about these stories together. Why haven't historians approached it in this way before? Do you have any idea? I'll ask both of you that question.
Yeah, I'll take a quick crack at it. The main reason, I think, are the understandable depth of political commitments that people have. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were seen in the 1930s to be ideological opposites. People believed they had to choose. Then during the Second World War, obviously, the United States and the United Kingdom were the allies of the Soviet Union and fighting a terrible war against Nazi Germany. Then in the Cold War, things changed. But again, there was a reason to see in the Cold War the Germans as our allies and the Soviets as our enemies. There has never been a moment like the moment we have now where we can, with some clarity, look at the history as the history. There's also another event. There's another important point, which is that the Holocaust, as the worst of all of the killing policies, tends to overshadow all the rest. And one of my points in bringing the events together and comparing the Holocaust with other German policies and other Soviet policies is to allow us to see just how that was so. If we see the Holocaust as distinct, if that's the only thing that we remember from history, I fear that we will not understand its horror. It's only in comparison and in territory and time and context that we can actually understand it.
I would just add, I think Tim's made an important point about this being a territory in between, and therefore there are a lot of ambiguous and competing claims to the territory. Part of it is ideological, and clearly that was the dominant conflict, the conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union. But there are also national claims to this territory. So there are many, many reasons why people are animated about the fate of the territory and really are quite assertive in establishing their story as the predominant story. And once they do that, the rest of the pieces tend to get shoved to the background.
Another point you make in the book of why this story hasn't really been told in this way until now is that after the war, U.S. and British forces never reached these areas, the so-called Bloodlands. So this was history hidden by an Iron Curtain.
Yeah, one of the things which is important to understand is that all of the territories where the Germans killed in large numbers, all the death factories, all of the worst of the shooting pits, these all fell under Soviet power after the Second World War. The Americans and the British liberated a good deal of Europe, and we think we liberated the places where Hitler committed his crimes, and we were simply wrong. We only got to the edge of it. The worst of it was beyond our vision. We never saw it. The films we have of Belsen are not films of the worst places, sadly. The sadness of all of this is that the horrible images that we have are only the beginning. And what follows from what you say is that in order for us to understand what the Germans did, we had to wait for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. We talk about the open archives in the post-communist countries as a way to understand Stalin and the Soviet Union, which is true. But it's also the case that we don't understand German policies, and we haven't fully understood the Holocaust until we had access to those archives, because those East European countries that we think of as being somewhere else were where the Holocaust actually took place.
You know, it's always fascinating when you talk to historians about this, and that as a career as a journalist, I always bought into the journalism 101 definition that journalism is the first draft of history. And without saying so, the suggestion then becomes that, well, then historians do the final version. But it's never final, is it? There's always a moving target, and both of you are well versed in all the new information that emerges at the end of the Soviet Union. And this becomes critical to your research for the book.
You have to be prepared for surprises. And history is always moving. It's not just an accumulation of information. We also just find things out that we didn't know before. So we didn't really understand until a few years ago, and Blair knows this as well, that the Soviet Union undertook, this is just an example, but it's a really sharp one, it undertook ethnic shooting actions in the 1930s. 250,000 people were killed basically because of their nationality. Nothing else like that was going on in the rest of the world at that time. And it's only with access to Soviet documents that we can see things like that. So it's important to understand that history is a kind of informed conversation. We're always getting more access to documents, and then we have ideas, and those ideas improve the general discussion. So with an event like the Holocaust, we had some of the basic outlines, but even the things that seem the clearest to us, we're still learning about.
revisionist history gets a bad name in common usage, but here the review of this book in The Economist calls it revisionist history of the best kind. It says that you make the reader rethink some of the best-known episodes in Europe's modern history. How do you approach these studies?
No, I think Tim made a very important point that history does evolve, and not in a cynical way at all. We ask different questions. We're interested in different subjects. But as importantly, there's often new evidence which should force us to rethink our assumptions about what happened. And I think the kind of glib notion that revisionist history is somehow a political game really misses the deeper point that we actually come not just to think differently, we sometimes come to know more. And Tim's work is a perfect example of how we've come to know more about what happened in that region.
You write about visions of transformation, two different visions of transformation, one from Moscow, one from Berlin. Could you define what those were?
Yeah, again, you can see a certain kind of similarity, which is that both the Soviets and the Nazis wanted rapid economic and political transformation. But you can also see an important difference, which is that the Soviet vision, which I call internal colonization, involved taking the territory that you have, exploiting the people that you have, transforming them in what they do, chiefly peasants into collective agrarian laborers, private agriculture into state-controlled agriculture, in such a way as to control a resource which was food, which would allow you to export, get capital, and thereby build up an industrial country very, very quickly. The German vision was a bit different. Germany was already an industrial country by the standards of the day. What Hitler wanted was to balance industry with agriculture, and he had a utopian vision of a frontier empire which would extend eastwards across Poland into the Soviet Union to the Urals. And this would allow Germans to move back into what he saw as a place which would restore them to their rightful place. It would make them an imperial people. But along the way, he imagined destroying the peoples who already lived there, not just the Jews, but tens of millions of Slavs. So these regimes had in common the idea that they could develop quickly at the cost of certain people. But Hitler's vision required a war, whereas Stalin's vision required internal struggle against certain kinds of his own citizens.
In the book, very effectively, you do this comparison and contrast between Hitler and Stalin. Could you expand on that notion now? Some of the points you make, for example, that most of Hitler's killing was outside of Germany, and most of Stalin's killing was inside of the Soviet Union. If you would just run with that for a while and give us some of the other points that we need to understand about the differences and similarities.
Yeah, just to start, what I think about comparison is that, and here I'm following on a point Blair made, the more we know, the better the comparisons are. So a lot of us think that we know how to compare Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, that it's all set. So for example, typically in America, people would say, the Soviets killed far more people, but the Germans were worse because they killed for racial reasons. Neither of those propositions is actually true. The Germans actually killed more people than the Soviets, and we now know this on the basis of documents. And it's true that the Germans very often killed for racial reasons. However, there are these ethnic actions in the Soviet Union which makes us realize that even that difference is not as clear as we once thought it had been. In my view, there are some nevertheless very fundamental differences. Stalin was basically in retreat. The Soviet Revolution had failed to do what it was meant to do in 1917, and the Soviet Union, the creation of a state with fixed borders, was a kind of retreat. A second retreat was trying to build up industry within those borders without outside help. And a third retreat was the retreat to terror, when people were killed in 1937 and 1938 because it seemed like there were enemies from abroad, and Stalin had paranoid visions of how those enemies were cooperating with people from within. The difference between the German vision or the Nazi vision of the world and the Soviet vision was that this was a vision of expansion in the service of a small racial minority. It took for granted that a small part of the world's populations, the Germans, deserved to control vast territories. There was never a pretense that this was a revolution on behalf of all people. And as a result, as you say, the Germans killed others rather than themselves, which is the Soviet way. And the German killing was simultaneous with war. The Germans didn't really kill until there was a war. In the 1930s, the Soviets killed incomparably more people than the Germans. But once the war starts, it switches around, and the Germans kill millions of civilians and other non-combatants combatants
Not
during the war.
casualties of war. That's the very important
Yeah.
point. These 14 million whose fate you chronicle were not casualties of the battlefield.
That's an important distinction. I mean, the book begins with recalling the importance of the First War, and in the background of the book is the Second World War. But these 14 million people, and that's a stupendous number, not a single one of them were casualties of war.
Let's spend some time on this number, because one of the key points of your book and your approach is to give life to this, to make sure that people view this as human beings with stories, with backstories, not just a giant incomprehensible number. Talk a bit about how you approach that, because it does feel, we say 14 million, and it is numbing. It's hard to really relate to that.
Yeah, I would say even much smaller numbers are numbing. 14 million is numbing, 6 million is numbing, 3 million is numbing. I'd say even 20,000 we have a hard time getting our minds around. And that, I think one of the reasons why 9/11 was so stirring to people is that we could just imagine what 2,000 people or 3,000 people would mean. But when you get beyond that, it becomes very hard for us. So you're absolutely right. One of the whole premises of the book is that we start with people. So we don't say this is only about Jews or only about Poles or only about Ukrainians or only about Russians or Belarusians. We note that on this territory there lived people, and 14 million of them died. The reasons why they died, of course, had to do with who they were, but the basic premise is that there are 14 million people and they died. Along the way, I tried to do what a lot of scholars of the Holocaust are now doing, which is use testimonial evidence, not just from Jews, but from other peoples, so that we have a sense that the lives that I discuss represent, as you say, individuals. And we have actually much more evidence of this kind than we thought we did. And we can use that to make each life count.
I think the book does that amazingly effectively. There were moments where I had to stop reading. There's the emotional reactions. I think of one passage, a young girl writing that she was calm about her faith, other than the fact that she realized 20 was a rough time to die.
Yeah, I mean, that's an example of the kind of evidence we have. Those words were scratched on the inside of a synagogue wall in a little town in Ukraine by a girl who was with several dozen other people who knew they were about to be marched out to be shot. We have evidence like that. We have notes that were thrown from trains. We have diaries that were found on bodies. We have an amazing amount of evidence which can restore at least a certain amount of, at the very least, reality, and I like to hope dignity, to these people.
Blair, what's your thought about how a book like this and how this form of history will be accepted in the current Russia?
Well, I think it's in a way, very problematic book for the entire region. I wouldn't
not just Russia.
Not just Russia. This is a region that's trying to redefine itself, to redefine boundaries, to establish who is rightfully in this place or that place. And I think from my perspective, one of the tragedies of the last 20 years is that discussion has turned extraordinarily abstract, and people have deep vested interests, emotional interests, political interests, in reading out human beings from the story. And I think one of the real powers of Tim's book is exactly that it rehumanizes what happened. And that is very important at a moment when the world, particularly this corner of the world, is full of people who want to dehumanize this history and reconceptualize it so that they're at the center of the story. And I think it would be unfair to single Russia out. This is a region that is deeply involved in reinventing itself. And unfortunately, I think a lot of, not just Tim's work, but a lot of work like Tim's is viewed as too challenging, because you no longer have simple outcomes when you begin to look at.
Yeah, I certainly didn't mean to single Russia out. I was more in deference to your area of expertise than.
No, but I think it's very important, because I think there is, Russia is often scolded here, right. And there are many, many reasons why one might want to be concerned about contemporary developments in Russia, but Russia doesn't stand alone.
What kind of feedback have you been receiving? I've seen some reviews of the word controversial pops up.
Yeah.
What do people find controversial?
Controversial is my least favorite word
is a
in
horrible
the
word, isn't
English language, because it's not what you think, it's not what I think, it's what somebody out
non-committal.
there,
It's also
someone
a way
thinks.
yeah.
And I have to say, thus far, I've been struck by the total absence of controversy about this book. Like it's yet to be the case, at least to my knowledge, that someone has written and has written a coherent review which actually started some sort of controversy. The review attention has been really positive, and I would emphasize that here in the States, speaking to people who have the same kinds of vested interests, it's also gone surprisingly well.
I think one of the significant challenges to the conventional wisdom approach to history that your book suggests is that it wasn't this clean, if that's the right word, industrial type killing, assembly line camps, that it was much messier than that, and if it's possible, even more horrific than what most people think of.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad to say it, but I think the general image of how the Holocaust took place is much too clean and much too simple. We don't generally remember that the Holocaust began with millions of shootings in the East, that the gas chamber itself involved terrible, terrible suffering and humiliation at every step. We don't remember that these were people in contact with people, that as time went past, they more and more understood what was happening to them. So I tried very hard to break the Holocaust down into its parts so that we could see the shooting in the East. We could see the shooting in Ukraine and Belarus. We could also imagine what it was like for individuals in the death facilities in Poland, and then finally in Auschwitz. And I think, unfortunately, you're quite right that when you actually try to present the Holocaust in all of these different ways, you realize that what we have is unfortunately an image which denies us access to the real depths of the horror of it.
You write, the very worst of the killing began when Hitler betrayed Stalin and German forces crossed into the recently enlarged Soviet Union in June 1941. What was that a catalyst for? Why did the worst killing occur then?
Yeah, there are basically three stages of the killing in the book. The first is from 1933 to 1939, when the Soviets, as they try to modernize their country and then as they carry out what they see as prophylactic terror, are doing almost all of the killing. From 33 to 39, what the Germans do is on the scale of thousands, and the Soviets are on the scale of millions. Then there's a sort of compromise stage, which is 39, 40, 41. When the Germans and the Soviets have together invaded Poland, Stalin also takes northeast Romania and the Baltics and invades Finland, and all of that allows the Germans to invade the Low Countries and France and start the Battle of Britain. During that intermediate stage, German practice approaches Soviet practice. They're both killing in the tens of thousands on this stage and deporting on the hundreds of thousands. What changes in 1941 is that the Nazis do what they had always planned to do, which is invade the Soviet Union. Why is that so important? For two reasons. The first is that the whole plan had always been to go east. From Hitler's point of view, war with Britain was something which hopefully could be avoided. Dealing with France was something which came along and had to be done. But the real war was always, in his imagination, in the east. And that war involved colonization. The idea was that not only would the Jews all be eliminated, but tens of millions of other people would be starved in the first winter of the war. After the war was won, tens of millions of more people would be assimilated, enslaved, or killed, so that all of this could become very quickly this frontier empire. So the Germans go into the war with those moral premises on the Eastern Front. To use Hitler's words, it's a war of destruction from the very beginning. And as the war progresses, the people who are actually destroyed increasingly, it begins with the Slavs, but increasingly it's going to be the Jews who predominate. In 1941, it's about the same. But from the end of 1941 forward, the people who are going to stand for the Soviet Union are the Jews, and they're going to be killed for many reasons, but that's one of the ideological rationales. And that's the other thing I wanted to mention. One of the reasons why the war in the Soviet Union is so bloody is because of the Nazi anti-Semitic idea that the Soviet Union was a Jewish state. So invading the Soviet Union brings together all sorts of cultural and strategic versions of anti-Semitism, and it leads to this notion that the Nazis have, that to win a war you have to kill Jews.
We're very short on time, but a couple things I want to get to before we completely run out of time. One, let me ask it in a gimmicky way. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 not much, 10 most, how much did the research and the writing of this book change your perception of this time period in history?
Well, it's more, John, it's more that having worked on this period in a lot of other ways, I realized that this was the most important subject in my own field, and that I ought to be writing this book. I did learn some things that surprised me along the way, but it's more the case that in doing other kinds of research, I realized that there was terror, there was killing of prisoners of war, there was a Holocaust in the East, that there were these pieces, and that all these pieces were in my field and ought to be brought together.
There's a question you raise in the book, and I'll ask each of you to briefly weigh in on an answer to it. And the question that Tim raises is very challenging. Is truth nothing more than a convention of power, or can truthful historical accounts resist the gravity of politics?
Blair, you take that first.
I can take that simple question in a quick way. Well, at some level, history can't, and historiography can't escape, but it's really important that it try to escape, and that there is a sense that there is an evidential, if not truth with a big T, at least a record of evidence that needs to be examined over and over and over again, so that the telling of the story doesn't become simply a political act.
Yeah. In that passage, I'm referring to things that Hannah Arendt and George Kennan said about how German and Soviet power were transforming the very idea of truth into something which simply served the momentary interests and perceptions of a regime. And obviously, I'm asking the question rhetorically. I agree with Blair that most of the time we fall into the gravity of political systems and political interests, but that what we ought to be doing ethically is striving very hard, using rigorous, honest methods, to preserve an animated and accessible record of how people experienced things, and that this is a legitimate it's a legitimate endeavor, and it's a possible endeavor, although it's very hard.
Do you need reading glasses? I hope not. I'm going to ask you, would you read the last paragraph of your book?
I'd be very happy to.
I think this is a good final word for our discussion. I highlighted it right here for you.
Thanks, John. The Nazi and Soviet regimes turned people into numbers, some of which we can only estimate, some of which we can reconstruct with fair precision. It is for us, as scholars, to seek these numbers and to put them into perspective. It is for us as humanists to turn the numbers back into people. If we cannot do that, then Hitler and Stalin have shaped not only our world, but our humanity.
Tim Snyder, thank you. Blair Ruble, thank you as well. We'll be back next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.